Today's lesson is what are the parts of the quadratic function. The vertex of a parabola is the turning point of the graph. It is the graph's highest point or the lowest point, depending on which way your parabola is facing. The axis of symmetry is the line that divides the parabola in half. The axis of symmetry is always going to be in the form of x equals some number. And in standard form, so this process only works from standard form. If you want to find the axis of symmetry, you can do x equals negative b over 2a. Take a second to copy down those notes and then we'll talk about them. When we talk about the vertex, and we say that is the highest point or the lowest point of the graph, that's because our parabola can either face upwards like this, and your vertex is the lowest point, or our parabola could face downwards like this, and this would be the highest point. So this is the lowest point of the graph. This is the highest point of this graph. But in both cases, these 2 points represent the vertex, or the turning point. Now the axis of symmetry divides the parabola in half, and it always cuts through where your vertex is. So in this parabola, this blue line would be my axis of symmetry because it cuts right through the vertex and it divides my parabola in half. In this other parabola, this blue line would be my axis of symmetry because it cuts my parabola in half and it cuts right through my vertex. So both of these lines represent the axis of symmetry for each parabola. So the axis of symmetry will always be x equals some number, and the vertex will always be a point. Given the following graph, what is the axis of symmetry and the vertex? Take a second to copy down the question and a quick sketch of the graph. When I'm finding my axis of symmetry, I need to remember that my axis of symmetry is always going to be in the form of x equals some number. So it's always going to be x equals some number. And my vertex is always going to be a full point. So there'll be an x value and a y value. When you're looking at your graph, you just need to find the highest point or the lowest point. Since this graph is facing downwards, I'm looking for the highest point. This point is the highest point. That's the turning point. My graph is going up until it gets to that point. Then once it hits that point, it turns and it starts going down. So that would be my vertex, which is at 2.5 for the x. And the y value is about 146. Since it's not right on the grid, if you're close, that's okay. Now my axis of symmetry always cuts directly through my vertex. So this would be my axis of symmetry. So my vertex, my axis of symmetry, would be x equals 2.5. So if you notice, whatever the x value is for the vertex, that's always going to be the number that represents your axis of symmetry. And even though this vertex doesn't look like it cuts my graph directly in half, that's because I'm only showing the first quadrant. So if this parabola were to continue, it would continue over here, and it would be the exact same as this other half of the parabola. Given the quadratic function f of x equals x squared plus 2x minus 4, find the axis of symmetry and the vertex. Take a second to copy down the question. This quadratic function, this is in standard form. So when we have a quadratic function in standard form, we can always find our axis of symmetry using the same formula. Our formula to find the axis of symmetry is x equals negative b over 2a. So I'm going to label what a, b, and c are from my quadratic function. My a is an imaginary 1 here, so my a is 1. The a is always the coefficient of the x squared term. The b is the coefficient of the x term, in this case, which is 2. And my c, even though I don't need it in my axis of symmetry formula, I'm still going to find it. My c is negative 4. So I'm going to use that information to find my axis of symmetry. I have the negative, and now I'm going to substitute my numbering using parentheses. So I have negative 2 over 2 times a, which is 1. When I do that, negative and this positive 2 becomes negative 2. 2 times 1 is 2. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. So my axis of symmetry is x equals negative 1. Now I also have to find my vertex. My vertex is always going to be a point. If I look back at my previous problem, I remember that my axis of symmetry number and the x value of my vertex are always the same. So since I have x equals negative 1 here, I know that the x value of my vertex is negative 1. Now I need to find the y value. In order to find the y value, I need to find what f of negative 1 is. So I can substitute negative 1 into every x. So I have negative 1 squared plus 2 times negative 1 minus 4. Negative 1 squared is positive 1. Positive 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And the minus 4 comes down. Now I'm just going to use my order of operations to simplify this. 1 minus 2 is negative 1 minus 4. Negative 1 minus 4 is negative 5. So my y value would be negative 5. So that would be my vertex. Negative 1, negative 5. And the last problem. Let h of t equal negative 16t squared plus 64t plus 80 represent the height of an object above the ground after t seconds. What is the maximum height of the object? Take a second to copy down the question. In this problem, we have t seconds, that's our x, and then we have h of t for the height. And if we look at our equation is a parabola or a quadratic function in standard form. And the reason why our equation is in a quadratic function is because if I were to think about it, if I have an object and I throw it up in the air, at some point it's going to go up and then it's going to reach a point and will start coming back down again. So that is why our function here is a quadratic function. So we're looking for the maximum height. That means we're looking for this highest point or we're looking for the vertex. And since we want the maximum height, the height is our y and the time is our x. So I need to find the y value of the vertex. In order to find the vertex from a quadratic function standard form, I need to first find my axis of symmetry. Using my formula, x equals negative b over 2a. In this quadratic formula, my a is negative 16, my b value is 64, and c is 80. When I substitute in, I have negative parentheses 64 over 2 times negative 16. Negative times a positive 64 gives me negative 64. 2 times negative 16 is negative 32. Negative 64 divided by negative 2 is 2. So I get that x equals 2. But remember, in this problem, our x is t, so we have t equals 2. That means that the time is 2 seconds for this object to reach its maximum height. But now I need to find the y value of the vertex. I know what my x value is. I know it's 2, but I need to find the y value. In order to find the y value, I'm going to find h of 2. h of 2 is negative 16 times 2 squared plus 64 times 2 plus 80. When I simplify this, I'm going to do my exponents first. 2 squared is 4 plus 64 times 2 plus 80. Now, using order of operations, I'm going to do my multiplication first. Negative 16 times 4 is negative 64. 64 times 2 is positive 128 plus 80. When I continue to simplify, negative 64 plus 128 equals 64 plus 80, and 64 plus 80 is equal to 144. So the y value is 144. So that means the maximum height of this object is 144 units, since they don't tell us what the units is.